Across the Chesapeake Bay watershed, agriculture is one of the bay's largest sources of pollution. When manure and fertilizer are over-applied or poorly managed, rain doesn't just water the fields, it washes those contaminants into nearby streams. For decades, farmers, advocates, and agencies have been working to reduce agricultural runoff. But gaps in enforcement and weak permits still allow some operations to send too much pollution downstream.
For the Chesapeake Bay watershed, agriculture is the largest pollution source. Agriculture accounts for, I believe, about 60% of the nitrogen that goes into the bay. We underspend when it comes to pollution controls for agriculture because if you look at wastewater treatment plant upgrades, for example, or control of runoff from municipal sources, it is dramatically, orders of magnitude less expensive to control a pound of nitrogen or phosphorus from an agricultural field or from the agricultural industry than it is, say, to reduce that same amount from a wastewater treatment plant.
Let's take a look at a hot spot for agriculture with Taylor Swanson, the Chesapeake Coastkeeper. One of the heavy, intense agriculture areas in the Chesapeake Bay watershed is the Eastern Shore, right? Maryland, Delaware, a little bit of Virginia over there. Could you describe that landscape, especially the presence of these concentrated animal feeding operations, the poultry industry?
Majority of land use down on the lower Eastern Shore, mostly Worcester County, where most of our work is focused. A huge percentage of the land use is in agriculture. Of that huge percentage, the majority is in grain production for the poultry industry. So the poultry industry has a small footprint, but is producing an enormous amount of livestock and crop, if you will, out of their farmhouses, the chicken houses. Eastern Shore rivers have gone backwards. Most are either stagnant or they've literally gone backwards in their impairment. And so, to me, the Eastern Shore people right now need to take that step backwards and not look at the bigger puzzle, but look at their small scale. And not just the whole Eastern Shore, but look at each individual river and start looking at what is going on there.
Those rivers are impacted by a particular kind of agriculture, industrial-scale poultry operations packed into a relatively small landscape.
The concentrated animal feeding operations, or poultry CAFOs, is really the looms large with regard to the Eastern Shore. There are about 550 operations. If you think about what that represents over 300 million chickens, birds produced every year. And with that production comes waste streams.
With millions of birds comes one big question. What happens to all that waste?
Ammonia is a form of nitrogen. With the dust and dander and ammonia, that builds up inside the houses. And that is evacuated by anywhere from 8 to 16 fans, these giant vent fans that draw the air out and pull in fresh air. The agency, the Maryland Department of the Environment, and other states actually consider these vent fans as an exclusionary ventilation system. So they're not considered smokestacks, as you would think if you were talking about an air permitting system. In fact, ammonia is a toxic air pollutant under Maryland law. But these warehouses are excluded. And why? Because they consider the vent fans ventilation systems. Ironically, they say it's for bird comfort.
Kathy Phillips, the former Chesapeake Coastkeeper, has seen the challenges firsthand. Tell me more about the impacts on the community and the environment from these CAFOs.
This was the silent pollutant, was ammonia and ammonia deposition. So ammonia gets blown out of the houses by the fans. It lands on grass fields, these ag ditches. If you live on the Eastern Shore, you're very familiar with agricultural ditches. These have been around for 100 years. They are there to help. The Eastern Shore is a very low-lying area and wet. And so these ag ditches intersect the entire Eastern Shore like a spider web, and they drain water from fields. But they all connect eventually and drain to a waterway, Pocomoke River, our coastal bays, Chesapeake Bay, with so many poultry houses on the Eastern Shore, so many millions of chickens being grown every year on the Eastern Shore. This air pollutant is now becoming a water pollutant.
On average, the industry emits 30 to 40 million pounds of ammonia, form of nitrogen, every year. And it just goes out into the atmosphere like this cloud over the eastern shore. What they also modeled determinatively was that approximately 10 million pounds of that can be shown to be deposited and delivered into the major rivers on the eastern shore. The Choptank, the Pocomoke, the Nanakoke, the Wacomico, all, by the way, already impaired for nitrogen. 5 million pounds can be shown determinatively to be delivered to the Chesapeake Bay alone. And when you look at the numbers and some of the numbers we've talked about, that is more than all of Maryland's wastewater treatment plants combined. And so the failure to regulate this pollution stream is a total failure for protecting water quality, not just the Chesapeake Bay, but every river on the eastern shore.
What has happened recently to try to make progress on this issue?
Maryland has a statewide permit that governs this industry. It's called the CAFO permit, which essentially provides narrative standards under which all 550 operations have to be granted coverage. They apply for coverage under the statewide permit and are granted that coverage and have to follow the narrative standards in that permit. Part of those narrative standards protect relatively well against wastewater streams. So they have to have best management practices for stormwater ponds, for wastewater just running off the property and carrying, for example, chicken manure with them. So there are protections within that permitting system. But what has evaded their permitting scheme is ammonia emissions. So in 2019, the state put out another statewide concentrating animal feeding operation permit. What they failed to regulate, again, is the air emissions. We, working with the Assateague Coastal Trust and the Assateague Coastkeeper, Kathy Phillips, we initiated a lawsuit challenging that permit. In the spring of 2021, a Maryland Circuit Court judge ruled that this, in fact, should be regulated under the permit. The judge found that this is an enormous pollution stream and that all this nitrogen was covered under the permit. The reason being that the Clean Water Act does contemplate that the deposition of these emissions actually are water pollutants. When they lost, they appealed to the Court of Special Appeals, and it was quickly petitioned to the Maryland Supreme Court. At the Maryland Supreme Court, the state agency changed its litigation strategy, which, by the way, they cannot do under common law. In the lower court, the state agency, Maryland Department of the Environment, denied that they had authority and jurisdiction to regulate these pollutants. They said, well, we were just kidding. We do have authority, but we have these discretionary standards by which we can impose best management practices and impose limits on growers if we determine there's a problem. The Maryland Supreme Court allowed them to make that rationalization and said, we defer to this agency. 5 years later, they have regulated exactly 0 out of 550 poultry operations. So that the issue continues.
So what might be next then, especially from a legal standpoint or from trying to work on this issue to address this?
The great part with that issue is we've identified a really cheap solution, which is that you put these vegetative buffers there. They're already required in some ways, but there's ways you can put layered trees and shrubs and grasses in front of the fan sites, and it captures some of the studies say up to 50% or more of the emissions that are coming in.
What does or could collaboration with the poultry industry especially, what could that look like? What are the opportunities there?
The most important reason why we need this collaboration right now is that burden cannot be just dumped on farmers outright. It needs to be talked about at large. The state needs to have an interest in paying for performance, paying the farmer to put in these practices, we think there's a common ground, which is that we, within those rivers, each own a piece of that river. It's a beautiful part of how water law is written here in America and written here in Maryland, that navigable portion of water from the high tide line down in Maryland is your public property. It's everyone's. And so whether you are a farmer or a school teacher or a cop or an environmentalist, don't care who you are, you all own it.